A lot of the folks that are serving in our leadership capacity at BGW also have parachurch experience too, whether they're serving on worship teams or as pastors. Austin Fredrickson, who does what I do, a lot of the initial design efforts, also planted a church for the Rock Church out there, and so they're wearing two hats oftentimes at the same time. So let's run this short video, Josh, on Adrian, and then I'll jump into our next topic.
I'm Adrian. I've been with BGW since 2002. I'm a architect and project manager. Typically, I get involved in the job at phase 3, which is our construction document phase, where we begin to put the drawings together for permit and for construction. And I'll follow that job from that point all the way through to the completion of construction. And really, I'm interacting with both the owner and the builder on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, just depending on the needs of the project. You know, one of the things I enjoy about working at BGW is not only getting to practice architecture, but also I believe that I'm playing a small role in helping God's truth be shared in communities across America. You know, we see this happening obviously when the building is done, when construction is completed, and the church is inviting the community into that new facility and sharing God's truth. But also when the church is using that new facility as a launching point, really to reach out into the community and share God's truth as well. But that's not the only time that I think this is happening. With our process, it actually happens, you know, the kind of inviting people to sharing God's truth and learn about God's truth happens actually before construction even begins. In our PCS process, where the church is sharing their vision with subcontractors and actually inviting some contractors to be a part of their mission and to share in their vision and to be a part of the project. And then when construction is happening, it's an intentional effort from the church to actually reach out and minister and share God's truth with the people that are working on their project for 8 to 12 months every single day. And it's neat to see that happening, that it's more than just a construction project. It's not only building a building, but it's also investing in people's lives, and specifically the people's lives of those that are actually working on the project.
So Adrian mentioned a lot of things in his short time on the screen. He mentioned the PCS process, which is what we call pre-construction stewardship. It's a process that I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about as I get into this. Our process really starts, though, with a charrette. I used that word a few times this morning. I heard Matt mention the word. Some of the speakers that we had on video have talked about the charrette process and how it went. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have participated in a charrette with a design group before? Jonathan, you did? Yeah, a few of you that I've had affiliation with, and some that I have not. So the word charrette is a process of design. It's an accelerated process of design that architects are typically taught in their program, their education process. I remember as a student, in the late 1970s, I started college in '75, finished a degree in English literature, and then went into architecture and realized pretty quickly the time commitment that I was engaged in. And I was taught, for the first probably 2 years of design, where they would assign a project to us, and then 8 weeks later, through the course of the evolution of that project, as it went on and on and on, we would have basically a schematic design for 8 or 9 weeks. And it felt like I was under constant pressure over those 8 or 9 weeks. And then I took a charrette class. And the first morning I walked in, the professor said, our project is that I want you to design a museum. Here's the program. Here's the spaces that we need. And it's going to be on this site in Geneva, Switzerland. They showed us the site, and they said, this is 8 o'clock in the morning. They said it's due at 5 o'clock this afternoon. I was like, what? You got to be kidding me. 8 o'clock, 8 hours, basically, 9 hours later, we had to turn in a project that was 60,000 square feet. And I couldn't even conceptualize the idea after having gone through this process of taking 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 weeks to design a building. Well, now that I've done it 350 times, I've learned a little bit about the accelerated design process. And I've learned of its advantages. One of those advantages is that in a normal process, you hire a design group and they come in and they hear what your needs are, and then they retrench and they go back to the studio environment, which is where all architects like to live, is in the studio. And they go back to the studio and they design their little hearts away, and they come up with a conceptual design or some design options, and then they come back and present that usually 3 to 6 weeks later. And they present that to the committee, and the committee looks at it and says, okay, well, that's pretty cool, we like that, but we don't like that, and man, that's one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen. And the architect's heart sinks because now that building is who they are. It's their identity. They've latched themselves onto this thing like it's their little baby, and somebody is criticizing my little baby. You know, nobody likes to have their baby criticized. You know, you've got a child that doesn't measure up here, and so it's difficult. Hector, you went through the process with us recently, that accelerated design process. I thought your group was particularly adept at offering a variety of inputs in a very short period of time, and really in a 2 or 3 day time period, we were able to come up with something that I think met a lot of needs as far as you guys were concerned. Is that your experience too? Yeah. Yeah. I should have asked you that question before we started in case you disagreed with me, and I didn't ask you. I didn't give you any time to even think about it. But yeah, and it is our experience is that it happens very quickly, but it happens because of the engagement with people who know not necessarily what they want, but they know how their ministries work, and they can provide input and they can provide feedback. And as long as we can sort of manage to set our egos aside, it's a much faster process that doesn't allow us time as designers to form that relationship to the project where we become defensive over any changes that are suggested. So the evolution of the project happens on a more natural basis. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll just summarize too what Adrian was saying in that video. Typically, phase 1 is that preliminary design process, and there is a homework stage that goes on ahead of that I'll talk about. I'll get into that a little bit more detail. Phase 2 is typically project positioning, which comes down to bringing somebody like, first of all, Tom has probably already been involved to help us understand what the potential is for the project, so we don't go in and design something way more than we should be designing. But then Chris would get involved, or an organization similar to Chris's would get involved and do the fundraising while it's going in for zoning approval. And zoning approval in today's world is no picnic. It takes time. We've got projects going on around the nation that are in their 2nd or 3rd year of zoning approval, depending on the jurisdiction. In California, we just plan on 2 years of zoning approval. That's the way it's going to be. And they'll tell you that openly. They used to hide it from you. They don't even hide it from you anymore. It's going to be 2 years. Phase 3 is getting the documents ready to go. Phase 4 is when that PCS process comes into play while the city is doing the permit review, so they're back at it again with a different department, and then finally we go into construction. And all through that involvement of those different phases, we strongly advocate for the general contractor to be engaged with us during that, and I'll explain why in just a few minutes. It starts with this 3-day charrette, and that charrette, by the way, is something we want the builder to participate in. The word charrette, by the way, is the French word for little chariot. And in the Beaux-Arts School of Design, back in the 1700s, the first organized school for training architects in an academic environment was the Beaux-Arts School of Design of Architecture in Paris, France. And so they would roll this cart in the studio doors on the east, and by the time they left the west doors of the studio, by the time the professor rolled the cart through, you had to have your drawings put onto the cart. So for architects, it means designing under time pressure and getting those drawings prepared and ready under the duress of time. So there is a time element to this. So we do this in a 3-day process. And again, ahead of that, there is a period of time where we do a little homework. It is very collaborative, and it's very cost effective. Normally, a schematic design process will take about 15% of the overall fee that an architect and engineering team will charge. The charrette process is about a third of that. So from a cost standpoint, it's much more cost effective, and it gets you off the dime and builds momentum very quickly. So it's a very good process in all those regards. There is this due diligence period as we start out on a process like this. First of all, we do need to understand what the site has to offer. If at all possible, we like to go see the site before the design charrette starts. Sometimes we're off the plane and we go to the site and we see some of the challenges, some of the attributes of the site, what some of the issues are. Certainly we've looked at site plans. Oftentimes we'll start with a civil engineering drawing or a survey of the site to understand topography, to understand what the zoning on the site is, to understand where the access points are going to be. That may initiate calls to the city to understand what their conceptual ideas are for the site. You have to look at cities these days or counties as your design partners. They're going to be in this with you, whether you like it or not. So understanding what their goals are for the site. Sometimes we'll get involved in projects and they want to do multi-use. We just are in the process of a project that we started in St. John's, Indiana, 2 weeks ago, and they're putting 32,000 square feet of retail space on their site. So we had to understand from a retail standpoint what the city's goals were, how they were going to have us establish the positioning on the project, what the parking counts were going to be, what setbacks were going to look like. All those kinds of things need to be understood before we start the process. We go through this independent financial analysis, and that's where Tom comes in. That's very helpful to us. It's amazing to me, committees who have been formed, who go out and do studies, they come back and they have disparate ideas about what they think they can raise. And so it's important for us to get to the truth of that. And I will design the sky, the moon, and the stars for an organization, but if all they can afford is the sky, I need to know that going in. You know, we'll show them this is the phased approach. And it's not unusual for us to get a report back from Tom, and the church has put together a programmatic statement that says, boy, we need like 40,000 square feet. And Tom will come back and tell them, you can afford 15. Okay, that's a shock. That hurts their feelings. But it's an important thing to know going in. Okay, let's design the 40,000 square feet. Let's show you how you can get to this point. But here's some ways that we can economize. Here's some ways that we can dual purpose some of the spaces in the building. And here's a legitimate first phase that will get you off the dime. And then they have some choices to make. Is that what they want to do or not? And if they can't, then we ought to know that going in so that they're not spending wasting time and wasting energy on the things that they think they can get done. It may be best to learn this information and to pause for a few weeks or a few months or a year to get the house in order, to understand. Some of the information that comes back from Tom is just how to deal with debt, how to get their own financial picture looking better to an organization that's eventually going to evaluate that and understand what is your potential to raise money. I always tell people this, design is fun. It's great. Everybody loves it. Construction is fun too. The day the crane shows up and you start tilting up the concrete panels, it's like instant building, right, Steve? It's amazing. Money is hard. Money is always hard. So getting to the bottom during that initial stage is very important to understand so that we can get things properly lined up, properly phased, and approach the project in a way that something gets built. I mentioned before, 40% of our projects have been designed by other architects. Almost always, it's because they hit their head against the financial wall. They just don't know what to do with it. So they ignore it. And they design their hearts out. Beautiful building, never gets built. That's not good stewardship. And stewardship is a biblical mandate. It's something that Christ used parables to talk about what man doesn't start the project off and count the cost, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to do. So that's part of the process. The community needs analysis is another one. We've shown a lot of examples today of buildings that met community needs. Sometimes we'll show up to a charrette and maybe the question hasn't been asked properly or answered properly, but they'll say, well, so tell us what our community needs. I don't know, I don't live here. You live here. Let's talk about that. Well, I'd like to have that conversation ahead of time, or if you don't know, we can show you some resources where you can go find out, where you can go plug in. You know, the government can greatly influence the success or the failure of a project, but they can also really help in the regards that they oftentimes have their finger on what their community actually needs. So going to talk to them. Where does the community stand on health care, child care? A project over in Bradenton, daycare for adults. There's a huge need for that project. You know, those kinds of things come out in an analysis to understand what communities are actually up against. What are the things that a community needs? So all of these things have to be, we have to sort of get our arms around. Not all the questions answered, but the questions on the table, at least, so that when we start design, we're not designing in a vacuum. That's a dangerous place to be as a building committee who's got stars in their eyes and an architect that is blinded by those stars. So understanding what the demographics, the actual demographics are. And sometimes in communities we find that the church has an understanding of the demographics that's 20 years old. They don't really know who's in their community. They don't understand that we want to do a preschool, but the preschool kids moved out of this community or aged out of this community 15 years ago. There's no more preschool kids in this area. Doesn't make sense to go build it and they will come. We're not big build it and they will come folks. Understand what you can really do. And getting that demographic information. So Matt will do demographic studies through his organization, True North, which he'll talk about in a minute, to help us understand who's really here. What do the ethnicities look like in the community? How well are you addressing those ethnic issues? How is that happening? So those kinds of things are very important for us to get under our belt as we go into these projects. Okay. For years, architects have used this phrase. They've said, and this came out of, back in the Roman days, there was an architect by the name of Vitruvius, and he didn't use the words budget, function, and aesthetics. He used the words commodity, delight, and structure, which basically translate into budget, function, and aesthetics. He said, these are the three components of a project that pull and tug on one another. And for years and years and years, builders and architects will say, you get 2 out of 3, you don't get all 3. Which ones do you want? If you're going to focus on budget and function, this is going to be one ugly building. If you're going to make us do a beautiful building and it's going to function well, we're going to spend money like there's no tomorrow. You get 2 out of 3. Well, the truth is that on these projects, we cannot afford to throw one of these to the wind. We have to be able to find the balance point between these three. It's important for us to do. I mean, I was taught, form follows function. You got to make sure that the building functions. If the building doesn't function, then simplify the look of the building and make sure that it functions. That's an important component. Subordinate the look of the building to make sure the building functions, because if it doesn't function and it's a beautiful building, it'll be great on opening day and then people won't use it. Like I said before, you design a worship space or a performing arts space for a school, if they can't see and they can't hear, it's a failure. It doesn't work. It's got to function from those kind of standpoints. So we're always looking to strive to find how do we get the best out of these three and find that balance point. We start with right sizing. That's oftentimes where things go off too. Architects are trained in school to use these certain components of planning to be able to size their facilities, and sometimes we get involved in a facility and we find out that the net to gross, net being inside of a wall of actual square footage, gross being corridors and electrical rooms and mechanical spaces, sometimes the net to gross is way, way lower than it should be. We're trying to design buildings that are 80% net to gross and above, and sometimes we'll get involved in a facility design, they'll plop a set of plans down and I'll look at the net to gross and it's 60%. It's like a hospital. Tiny little rooms, big wide hallways, crazy numbers. And so getting the building right-sized is an important component. That exercise happens before the charrette even begins. We've got to get the programming right on a building to understand that. A lot of times I'll walk in with a diagram like this that is a bubble diagram based on site layout what the site looks like, what it has to offer, what the configuration of the building needs to be, what the orientation of the building needs to be, and what are the needs of the spaces. What are the short-term needs and what are the long-term needs? How does the building expand in the future? Let's say that you build a building and suddenly you go from a youth group, let's say that your youth group takes off and you go from 30 kids to 150 kids. How do you expand that without interrupting the rest of the flow of the building? Or your kids program. Let's say that you're successful and you start a pre-K like Brookhaven Church in McKinney, Texas, and all of a sudden you triple the number of young families you have in your church. How do you deal with that without interrupting everything else that happens from that point on for 2 years or 3 years, whatever the time period is for construction? So expandability is a huge important issue for us, and through these diagrams we can dive into the middle of that. So a lot of times we'll come in with 2 or 3 of these kinds of diagrams, almost like a Rorschach test. We put them up and we let people start commenting. Well, that's not near this, and this needs to be over here. That's an important thing for the architect to understand. How do you minister in your various departments? How do these departments relate to one to another? How does that happen? And how do we get back to that idea, that diagram that I showed earlier with the big circle in the center and all of the other circles around the outside? How does that happen? Especially if we're working in an existing building. A lot of times we'll walk out to an existing building and we'll find out that they're set up perfectly for the sequential church. They've got add-on-itis going on all over the property, right? Well, how do we get back to that centrality? How do we create that in this church? Which is a common story in Florida, by the way. I don't know how many campuses I've looked at where, it used to be the big thing to put the kids over here and to put the adults over here and put them in separate buildings and the youth out here on the 40 acres in the back so we don't have to listen to their loud music. These crazy diagrams where they're trying to pull people together. They're trying to bring the youth back into the core of the church. One of the strategies in the last 5 years that's really emerged is don't segregate your youth to the North 40. Bring the youth back into the core part of the church. Make them feel like they're part of the congregation again. Even if it's a multi-use space and it's not just their space, bring them back in. How does that work? The deliverables in a charrette in that 3-day time period is a master site plan, floor plans, building elevations, building perspectives. We don't do the fly around in the first 3 days. We wait until we go through an iterative process following the charrette to go back and forth. We typically don't do a cost estimate. We may do a cost range during the charrette to talk about that. It is an important component for us to understand what should we be designing, and it's very important for us to rely on good information. Architects don't have good cost information. I think you would agree with that, Steve, wouldn't you? The reason is because the contractors know where the market is at. And market conditions for construction can change dramatically in short periods of time. Remember in 2020 when electrical went from like $22 to $55 a square foot in the state of Florida? I was the last to know. I didn't know that. I'm not sure you guys were keeping up with it. It happened so rapidly, but you guys were way ahead of the curve from where we were. We were still publishing information at $22.50 a square foot for electrical at a time when it was bidding at $55, if you could find an electrical contractor to bid it. Contractors are much more attuned to the current market conditions. And then it fell, right? Came back to earth a little bit. Not down to 22, but it came back to earth a little bit. Now, Keith told me 35, so I'm going with that number, okay? All right, well, this is, by the way, I'm giving you an example here of the point-counterpoint that happens between architects and contractors. A respectful point-counterpoint situation where you can go through these kinds of iterative discussions to understand where are things really at that point in time is an important component of getting good information early on. It's an important component of understanding how to count the cost properly. Not just have an architect who's got his head in the clouds because he's attached to a design that can't be afforded, or not just going so conservative that you don't get half of what you need in the building so it's an important point-counterpoint type of relationship that is being built here. The master plan stuff, the stuff that's going on in this charrette, is not the stuff you're going to submit for building plan approval. This is conceptual stuff to get our arms around cost, to understand and how to take this to the larger group. How do we do that? So a site plan like this shows where the parking occurs, what the parking counts look like, how much of the land is dedicated to hard surfacing, where the building is positioned, what the orientation looks like, where the access points are. There's a lot of good information on a simple diagram like this. But we don't need to know at this point in time how big that parking stall is or where the drain inlets are for the storm drain system. We don't need to know that. We have to know what the cost is for it. We need to know where the ultimate drain field is going to be located and how we're going to get there, but we don't need to know all the detailed information. So these are kept superficial to start with. We'll start off with that planning diagram that I showed you a few minutes ago, that bubble diagram, and that on the second night will translate into floor plans. Floor plans that are meant to be changed. People will look at these floor plans and they'll say, yes, we love that, but we do not like this. This does not work for us. And that's okay. It's okay for us to hear and have an open discussion about what is working, what is not working. I don't know how best to say it, but this is the time. This is when we need to hear honesty. This is when people need to be able to have the freedom to speak up and say. And not necessarily do we say, okay, well then what would you suggest? They don't know what to suggest. They just know this isn't going to work. Or maybe they do have a really good idea. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a discussion where somebody in that group, not an architect, maybe just a person that is home raising kids, they have good ideas about what that children's space needs to look like. And it's important for us to hear that and listen to that. So that process allows us to go through those iterative discussions. We'll show them elevations like this. They don't really understand elevations. What they understand is drawings like this. So we'll show them 3D views of the building. And you know, it's funny, when you show somebody a building like this, you'll have half the group say, that's exactly what we were thinking. And the other half saying, are you kidding me? That's not a church. We're not doing that. Okay. We have to talk through this. We have to come to unity on this. You know, what are we going to do? Sometimes it's the older people, my age and older, who need to come around to the idea that there's a different set of expectations for younger people these days. They think differently about the way the building ought to look. I remember the discussion. I was in West Monroe, Louisiana, you know where the Duck Dynasty guys are? I wasn't working on their church. They were across town. I was working on another church, and one night, I'm in a room. There's like 40 people in the room, and they get into a discussion about symbology. I said, okay, so tell me what some of the important things are for you to convey on the outside of the building. And they said, one guy raised his hand, and he said, if we don't put a cross on the building, I'm not giving any money to this project. Okay, don't be throwing the gauntlet down on the second night. And a guy across the room said, well, you know, as politely as he could, there's a younger audience that has been distanced from church, and using religious symbols maybe isn't the best thing for us to do. Maybe we ought to back away from the cross and put the cross on the inside of the lobby or bring it into the worship center and not put it on the front of the building. Let's make it look more like an open community center. Well, that was 45 minutes of bing, 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 bing. Well, it turned out that the guy saying, I'm not going to put the money into the project unless we had a cross, and the guy that was trying to be polite was father-in-law, son-in-law. And this conversation had been going on for some period of time before I stuck my foot in the middle of that. As it turns out, one of the fellows in our office, who is a very gifted design guy, came up with a cross that was almost like a piece of sculpture. It was made out of shards of steel. It had these circular forms in it. It was very different, but you could definitely see the cross. And the young guy looked at it and said, hey, that's pretty cool. What if we put it in the front of the building instead of on the building? We put it into the garden area where the prayer garden is on the front and let people see it. And I mean, it was 20 feet tall. It was huge. And the old guy said, yeah, okay, I'll give my money to the project. I mean, he was being facetious at that point, but sometimes it's a matter of enabling people to talk it out and come to compromise and come to unity on things. And sometimes it's a matter of, you know, we're not going to do it in this session. Let's wait and give it some prayer and give it some thought and think about how we can do this in a way that meets everybody's objectives here. So that charrette process is really instrumental in being able to do that. And, you know, not everybody's going to like every image we put up. And I just warn them, you know, some of you are going to like this and some of you aren't, but let's find where the happy medium is. Let's figure out what that is. We can do interiors. We typically don't do interiors in the first 3 days. Interior renderings take about 10 times as long as the exterior renderings do, but we can follow up with them should we need to do those kind of things. Animations, we can do animations. I'm not sure I want to take all the time to show the animation here. Yeah, I'll skip this part and we'll go to the next. But animations where you can fly around the building, that is part of our charrette contract. And then we can fly into the building and do the interiors if you want to add the interiors into that too as well. The animations on the interiors are actually very helpful for people to understand scale. And they're better than they used to be. You know, we used to do interior animations and the architecture was terrific, but the people looked like monkeys. Their arms were doing this kind of stuff, you know. Now you can see there's a very natural movement to the people that move through the space, and it really does convey a whole sense of the material usage. It conveys a sense of color. Even you can get the lighting. Sometimes the lighting is a little bit different than what's going to actually come out in the final version, but it really does give people an understanding of what they're looking at for the future. Finally leading to a cost estimate, and that's after the charrette is over with, we drop the drawings back in the lap of the owner, and we want them to pray about it and think about it. Our typical charrette will do a couple of nights on site. The next week we'll do a Zoom call to follow up. It's usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours on the third night of the charrette. And at the whole time, you guys are engaged in the discussions with us. So the builder is seated at the table with us on these things and weighing in on not just the cost of the project, but other things, the constructability issues, the timing of how things happen, and the design. Brian actually has, Brian, wave your hand around so they can see you again. Brian is the owner of Collage. His training is actually into architecture, and he's always stepping on my toes, always doing that. I'm being facetious, but he's doing that at our invitation because we want everybody in the room to be able to have the comfort to speak outside of what they do every single day. And those kinds of discussions, when people have that freedom, we can get to the bottom line of a design that works a lot better. And so it's just a matter, I remember another project in the lower southeast part of the United States. I was working on it, and the pastor told me, I should have known this. The pastor said, "We're a pretty edgy group down here." And I'm thinking, edgy, really? Okay. So the next night I walked in with California Edgy, and their eyeballs about popped out of their head. Edgy to them was that instead of putting 4 white columns in a gable front, they wanted to put the columns in a rounded form. They didn't want it to look like Escondido. They wanted it to look like, you know, we were taking some dangerous steps with our columns on the front of the building. So the builder actually helped me understand that. The builder said, okay, I'm from this area. Let me tell you what they meant when they said edgy. They didn't mean this. They meant this. That's a very important thing for me to hear from somebody who is thinking about design from inside that community. So that's a role that everybody in the room ought to feel the freedom to be able to play, is that we're going to speak even if we're not trained formally as an architect. I tell Brian this all the time, I'm going to turn you into the state for practicing architecture without a license. So, but it's an important part of our process to be able to speak outside areas that we're normally involved with. Okay, so we'll transition into construction delivery method and how this relationship can play out to the benefit of an owner group. How can we get the best out of this? First of all, when I was serving as president of the AIA for the state of Utah, we used to go back once a year for our grassroots conference to Washington, D.C., to our headquarters. And we would go to the National Building Institute, and we would pick up the current statistics and have discussions with those that collect these statistics about how is the building industry doing, how is the architecture industry doing, what's happening. And it was reflective at the time of all kinds of conflict. At the time, everybody would admit that the world of architecture and construction was a broken process, meaning that there's all kinds of conflict that would happen between contractors and designers. And there was a wrestling match going on between who actually controls the process. Architects were trained, as I was trained, that we are the trusted advisor to the owner. Well, sometime in the 80s, when costs began to accelerate, architects began to lose that grip on being the sole trusted advisors because they weren't attending to the budget. So builders entered the equation and said, we can do that. We are better at controlling your architect than you are at controlling your architect. So architects suddenly got all defensive and felt like they were being subordinated to the builders. And they were, because they couldn't attend to a cost estimate. And that's what happens when you're not doing your job, and that part of your job is making sure that it can get built. So the conflicts are legendary across the United States. And conflict doesn't just mean that everybody goes through battles on the job site. It means litigation. And litigation, especially for public sector projects, can cost more than the construction. Litigation can end up costing an owner more than the actual cost of the project. So the statistics that are the most recent that we've collected from the National Building Institute is 78% of commercial projects are over budget. That's 4 out of 5 projects are over budget. On average, 70 days late, which is no surprise because there's not enough subcontractors to go around these days, especially in a state like Florida, where it's tough. You sign somebody up and you need 8 sheetrockers and 4 show up. It's tough to get them out there. 30% of construction projects end in dispute, and especially if they're a public sector project. Public sector projects, there's training courses held for folks around the nation about how to get to dispute, because that's where the money is to be made, is in dispute. And that's a dangerous place for everybody to be as an owner, because dispute costs you money and you're getting nothing out of it. So the 2 primary forms of contract that were prevalent back in the 80s and the 90s, and still today, by the way, is design, bid, build. Owner hires an architect. They may interview several. They hire the one they want. They go through the design process, and after the process is complete and they've got a set of drawings, they disperse the drawings to multiple general contractors. The general contractors, through the bid process, go out and saturate the market and get as many bids as they can back from the community to be able to assemble the best arrangement of prices so that when they go back in on bid day, 4 o'clock, Tuesday, October 4th, your bids are due, the bid opening happens, they look at the bids, and up to that point, there's been almost no conversation that happens between the designers of the project and the builders of the project. Everybody's holding their cards close to the vest. Why? Because they're in threat of competition. Nobody wants to reveal who their subs are, right? And oftentimes this leads to conflict because there is no such thing as a perfect set of drawings, and subcontractors are very adept at exploiting imperfect drawings. Or going to the code official and saying, hey, the last project that I worked on, they made us put insulation on all the outside walls here up through this level for fire insulation. Aren't you going to make them do that here? Okay, well, there's a $6,000 change order that the subcontractor initiated with the code official. So a lot of times the project cost that you get at bid day is not the project cost that ends up going out the door once the project is turned over. It's full of change orders and discussion and so on and so forth. So out of that, particularly in the public sector, came design build. Design build, the public sector clients said in the 80s, we are tired of the fight. We are tired of litigation. We're going to go to the market and we're going to ask the contractor and the architects to pair up in what I used to call shotgun marriage. So I would go out and find a contractor who I was known to, that I could get along with, and we would form a joint venture contract and we would go into the owner for that project. I was teamed up with them. And now in that relationship, I am subordinated to the general contractor. I do not work for the owner. So in a design-build arrangement, I work for the general contractor. So when it comes to matters of cost in a public sector project, if a matter of cost came up, I remember when I was doing a stadium project for Weber State Stadium, 2 of the floor levels of the 7-story skybox addition that we were putting on in this building were left incomplete. They came up with a little money. They said, we want to finish this off. I did a cost estimate for $250,000 to finish those 2 floor levels off. The day that it came to present to the owner, the general contractor walked in and handed him a change order for $750,000 on a $250,000 change order. And the owner looked at me and said, what do you think? You know what I thought? How do I get out of this job trailer? This is not my question to answer. So I just said, I don't know. And he's right. It was not my job to defend the owner, because I didn't work for the owner. I worked for the general contractor. Design build, though, can solve a lot of problems with architects who are out of control. And if you have a general contractor that can rein that in, you have a trusted advisor in that contractor now who is reining in one of the serious components to cost overrun, which is architects run amok, architects running wild. So general contractors have a much better tuned-in understanding of how to get to a real budget. But sometimes under the idea that you give too much control to the general contractor. So what BGW has said is that there is wisdom to bring a general contractor in as the trusted advisor, but to bring balance to that situation. So we form a hybrid. And the hybrid is that we are going to now bring them in as a trusted partner, and we're going to build relationship within the boundaries of that. So we have architect, owner, and contractor who have agreed in the beginning of the project to put the Lord in the center of that relationship. And that's the basis of where we start with. That's important. And to be able to allow the conversations that I just illustrated a few minutes ago between Steve and I about how do we get to cost. Okay, I'm thinking that we're down at $35 a square foot. You're waving your hand back and forth. Tell me. I mean, not right now, but I mean, later we'll have this little conversation. Tell me what's going on. What's driving that cost now? That's a beneficial conversation to have that doesn't typically happen in the face of the owner, and it needs to. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. It's an understanding too about if you can form this kind of relationship where you have a cooperative relationship of separate entities between architect and contractor, you have a much greater chance of turning that blue circle to a smaller circle instead of watching it bust out of the outer boundaries of that blue circle. Shrinking the pie. That's how you get to $700,000 savings on on Gateway, and $300,000 on Creekside, is that you bring in those opinions where you can shrink the size of that pie. Or $600,000, as Steve was telling me in the lobby, on the Presbyterian school that we did. That's the way that you bring the circle down in size. Those kind of conversations. So we start with pre-construction stewardship. This happens in a variety of ways. Sometimes it happens in a big room. The one that we did in Alabama, we had 70 subcontractors in that room, and we said basically in 1 hour time period, here's the ministry that we're working with in 5 minutes. Here's our strategy for how to go about building the building. Here's our systems in the building. Here's our schedule. Here's our cost estimate. We will give them our cost estimate. They're not going to base their bids based on their estimate. They're going to base their bids on how busy they are and who's in the room competing with them. All they want to know is, do you have enough money? Have you counted the cost, or are you in here wasting my time with a free lunch? That's what they want to know. So then going to them and saying, if this was your building, how would you do it? And incorporating their thoughts and ideas into the set of drawings, where they make sense. They don't always make sense. Sometimes they'll say, if you lop off these 2 classrooms, I can save you $75,000. Yeah, but we don't have 2 classrooms we needed. But if we do it this way, we can save, suddenly subcontractors come in with much greater ideas than the architects have even thought about, or the engineers. So that's a way to get to the bottom line of what we need to do. We have a factory direct purchasing side of things that you can use this. If it's better to purchase it locally, we can do that as well. We've got a number of different products that we've gone out and gotten national purchasing agreements, the way that Walmart does that. Once a year, you go out and you get a bid on a particular unit that we like. There's a good humidity control unit that we like to use. We form distance between the other ones, so we don't even allow them to bid. But we get a better price on that basis because we can promise them a certain number in a certain year time period. We'll talk about life cycle costing. That's another good bit of information to get from subcontractors, is the life cycle costing, meaning that it may go in cheaper, but the cost of keeping that product looking good over the lifespan far exceeds what the initial cost is. So we got to be wise about the kind of products that we're choosing to go into any particular thing. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is establish a way to set up a ministry on the job site. And you guys are as good as anybody that we work with in the nation. You know, Lee Corcoran and Gary, You guys have done a fabulous job setting up and working with the ministries that we work with to be able to do these kind of things. I'm going to show you, this is Shelley Teeters down at Cape Coral. You can turn that up a little, Josh.
When BGW said that one of the hopes that they had in partnering with organizations like us is that not only are we trying to reach people in our community, but also we have a ministry opportunity to try to reach the contractors and every person who walks on the job site. That really made us excited because we too have that same mission in mind. And so we really were very intentional about the ministry through the construction process. And we found it was a real way to engage the whole church, to be a part of the process. And so we created some teams, and every single day during the construction process, we provided drinks and snacks and food. You know, it's Florida, it's hot. And so for them to have a cold Gatorade or water and to come over and have an area, picnic tables in the shade where we can thank them and appreciate them and encourage them for what they did, that really just made it a very unique experience that I think most of these subcontractors had never experienced before. They were constantly thanking us and appreciating us for serving them. It also gave us a great avenue to, build a relationship with them. We have seen some fruit from that as well. We have a particular story where during the process, we had a contractor who was awarded a bid. He was going through a really difficult time in his life, and one Sunday, he actually showed up at Crosspoint and revealed that he was just going through a really difficult time, and ultimately he rededicated his life to Christ. He's been coming to Crosspoint ever since. He's in fact in my small group that meets every week, and I would never have met him, and God used Crosspoint's building project to bring him back to God. And what an incredible testimony and story.
I think I'm going to skip the rest of these slides, but I just want to say that this is kind of a deal breaker for us. The reason I made a switch in going from my own office, I had 25 architects working in my office. I don't know how many of them actually even knew I was a believer in Christ. I saw an opportunity to think about the way that I conducted myself in my professional life and make that consistent with who I am as a believer. This was an opportunity to do that. And so for all of our projects, this outreach type of thing is a very important component of what we do. And it is something that we talk about during that pre-construction process, is that your men on this job or the gals that will be supplying this job or working on this job, they will never be treated so well. And that's not the norm for them. Construction workers are used to be, it's a rough environment, it's difficult, it's fraught with tension, schedule problems, coarse language, you name it. And we're thinking about differently. We are the light of Christ. We can't go to war with people that are going to build our buildings and pretend to be Christians. We have to be people who are the light of Christ and be consistent with that. And sometimes that means taking 1/10% of our budget and putting it towards the chests of Gatorades that they put out for these guys and being willing to share and forge relationship to them. They don't all come to Christ. Some of them they're glad to have a cold Gatorade, and that's great. But some of them will go through marital discord or issues, and they'll show up later on because they know who's treated them well. And so this is an opportunity for us to be thinking about stuff like that. So Scott Griffin and John Workman in our office keep a book of 200 different ideas for outreach and how that works. We'll have people come out and participate in these various events that we do. But that is something that happens on all of our projects. And so we can get into that later on.